Hello, I'm Yoni Appelbaum, a senior editor at The Atlantic, and thank you all for joining us for this week's edition of The Big Story, a digital event series where we talk with Atlantic writers and editors about their latest work. I'm sorry that we can't be doing this in person, but I'm grateful to all of you for joining us digitally. This week, there's one story that all of us are thinking, talking, and writing about, the nationwide protests spurred by the death of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. It's just the latest in a long series of instances of police violence against Black Americans. The protests are unfolding during a pandemic that has disproportionately affected people of color. We know that Black Americans are suffering economically, getting sick and dying at significantly higher rates than other Americans. Today, I'm grateful to have with us a scholar who has helped illuminate and draw attention to these issues with his path-breaking and pioneering work, Dr. Ibram Kendi. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic and currently the director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. And I'm pleased to be able to announce today that he is also now the incoming director of Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research. So congratulations to Dr. Kendi on that. He's also the author of two books, including most recently, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Before we begin our discussion with Dr. Kendi today, I want to remind our viewers that you can be part of the conversation. In fact, that's the whole point. We very much hope you will. You can do that by typing your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'll incorporate them throughout the next 30 or 40 minutes as we talk. Try to keep your questions short and on topic, and be sure to tell us where you're watching from. And now let's dive in. Ibram, I'm going to start by reading something that you tweeted back in April, if I may. This was on April 19th as militias and other protesters were demanding that states reopen in the face of the pandemic. You wrote, "I'm imagining what would be happening if it were Black people across the nation defying stay-at-home orders and demonstrating in large groups against the law. Riot units would be breaking up rallies. Tear gas would be flying. Jails would be filling up. Trump would be raging." Reading that, my first temptation is to ask you for lottery numbers for tonight. But actually, I wonder if maybe that's a tweet that tells us a little bit more about the past than it does about the future.
Oh, without question. And I mean, I think for me, someone who's studied Black protests, I mean, and someone who knows the typical response to particularly anti-racist protests, that is the response that people are receiving today, which is you have a president raging, you have National Guards mobilizing, you have peaceful protesters being broken up violently by police, you have people going to jail. This has always really been the case when Black people, when their anti-racist allies challenge very deeply and critically American racism.
So one thing about this moment is that we can be unified by the images that we watch, whether it's an iPhone recording or broadcast news. But something else that I think we're all becoming increasingly cognizant of is that we can see those same images and see within them very different things. So I wonder what it is that you see this past week as these protests have started in Minneapolis and spread across the nation.
I see hope. I mean, resistance and people who have the courage to resist, people who are recognizing something as being wrong and not being sort of kept in their homes due to fear of police violence or tear gas, but instead they're coming out day after day to show their outrage to a man being kneed to death in Minneapolis, or a young woman being shot to death in Louisville, or even Latinx people all over this country being disproportionately infected by COVID-19, or Black and Native people disproportionately dying, and Americans of all races being thrown out of their jobs and sort of sitting in economic ruin. I mean, people are angry and people are upset and people are resisting, and that sort of always brings me hope.
I've got a question from one of our viewers here named Alex Marshall, who's wondering, having seen much discussion in the media of the right way to protest, whether there is a right way to protest, and perhaps I can add, how what we're seeing measures against that?
So, you know, Yoni, I mean, you're an historian. I study history. And so when an American says to me that violent protest is inherently and essentially bad and always bad, I say, well, wasn't the American Revolution, didn't it start with violent protest? And so I don't think that people should be thinking essentially that nonviolent protest is good, nonviolent protest works, violent protest is bad, violent protest never works. I certainly am someone who wants, who certainly is not somebody who's advocating for people in any way to be hurt, but that's an historical statement. When you make the case that nonviolent protest only works or is the right way to work. And because many of these people who are protesting this week have nonviolently protested in the past over police violence, and we're still facing the same problem.
So let's seize on that. We're not very long after Colin Kaepernick and then others in the NFL took a knee in order to draw attention to the very issues that have drawn protesters back into the streets today. Those protests were not greeted with decisive action at the time. In fact, Kaepernick was frozen out of the league. Do you think that the lack of a response to those earlier protests is part of what is feeding the current moment? Yes, and I think that it's only built. In other words, people have been nonviolently protesting for years upon years, and those nonviolent protesters, like most famously Colin Kaepernick, and the vast majority of Black Lives Matter protesters, they in many cases have not received or been able to win anti-racist changes to American policing, or those changes have been rolled back by the current administration or local administrations. And so people continue to die. And so I think that it's critically important for people to sort of recognize that history. Like many of the people who are on the streets today have been socialized in how all of the outrage to recent killings have not led to a sweeping radical change as they desired. So one common response to that is that change is hard and systems are complicated, and that it takes time, that bureaucracies move slowly. Have you seen any changes in the last couple of weeks that suggest to you that more rapid change is possible when leaders are firmly behind it? Well, I mean, I've seen, for instance, let's take Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Police Department has lost quite a few contracts. Those contracts from the University of Minnesota, I understand, from the local school board. And I think that is a manifestation of change, because in many ways that policing department is being isolated politically and financially. Or in other states where you've had mayors or who have issued policy sort of changes. I think in Louisville, if I'm not mistaken, they have suspended no-knock warrants, which of course was part of the reason for Breonna Taylor's death. And I suspect these things would not have happened if people did not demonstrate. We've seen over the last couple of days, both the President of the United States and a US Senator call for extensive and expensive deployments of troops across the country. One of the things that's striking about that is that they're not calling for that kind of radical measure in response to police violence, but rather seem to have been spurred to take hitherto unthinkable actions by looting. Do you see anything in that contrast? That to me is one of the greatest contradictions that I think should be very, very obvious to people right now. In other words, you have two different forces. You have two different voices. You have two different positions
that are emerging, sometimes within the same body. In other words, you have mayors and governors saying that these police killings are senseless, they're bad, they need to stop. And they're also saying that the violence against property, even the violence against police through these protests need to stop. But then what immediate policy changes have they made, typically across this country? They have issued curfews, which has sought to stem property, I should say violence against property and police, but that is not a policy change that will reduce police violence. They have brought in state police and national guards in the case of governors, which is again to stem the tide of violence against property and police. And so they made these immediate policy changes, but only to stem violence against property and police. And so the people on the ground are continuing to demand, well, what about us? What about our demands? You have the policy power right now to make some executive orders that reduce police violence, that transforms American policing. Why aren't you doing that too immediately?
You know, one of the things that struck me the last week is this is a movement that seems not to have leaders. Rather, it's a mass movement, largely spontaneous, taking to the streets in outrage and anguish. We have a viewer here named Jean Golden from New York who asks about that and wonders whether this would be more effective if there was a singular figure like Dr. King at the head of the movement. And I want to also flip that around and ask if maybe these movements are proving effective in part because they're not about any one individual, but about a mass movement.
I certainly do think there is no single national leader who is the sort of singular force behind the activism that is in the streets. But I think it's critically important for Americans to not think that King was in the 1960s, this singular sort of leader of even anti-racist protests, because he was very well respected among the anti-racist sort of community, among African-Americans, among their allies. But there were other Americans who had serious, obviously, problems with racism, who disagreed with King on a number of issues, and who saw other people as their leaders. You know, people like Malcolm X, and people ultimately like Angela Davis, or you know, a series of other folks. So I think it's critically important that even in the 60s, there was not a singular figurehead leader. Now, I think in many cases, white America tried to make King into one, but he certainly was not one for the people on the ground. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you know, was not taking leadership from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and King. CORE had its own leaders. And so I just wanted to sort of make sure we recognize that.
Yeah, so building on that then, we have a number of questions here from readers about the interplay of different causes on the streets. One thing that happened late in Dr. King's career is that he started to move economic issues a little bit more to the foreground and very rapidly discovered that even those white Americans who had been relatively sympathetic to his cause before then, when he started to get down into the actual stuff of inequality, turned on him, and he became a polarizing and unpopular figure, particularly in that last year before his death. Something that few who answered those pollsters wanted to remember afterwards. You know, I wonder about the different factors that are bringing people into the streets right now. Several viewers have asked about the way in which the pandemic and its tremendous impact on Black America has intersected with the long-standing frustration over violence from police. You've written extensively, you were actually there at the forefront calling for the gathering of statistics about the impact of the pandemic on Black America. And then you went out and helped us gather those actual statistics, which demonstrated the disproportionate impact. How are you thinking about the intersection of those issues right now?
I think obviously for every individual on the streets, there's probably a different set of factors. But I suspect, particularly for those who are protesting, who are either Black or brown, or who are deeply sympathetic, and seeking to create an equitable and just America and have the capacity to empathize with other groups of people, that people were reeling from the disparities, the racial disparities from COVID-19. And of course, those disparities really started to make national news the second week, of April. And so there was this reeling among people from those disparities, from those death rates, whether they were personally facing it, their family members, or just the outrage about the disparities in general. And then the outrage, I suspect, only built when Black people themselves were blamed for disproportionately dying. And I suspect the outrage only grew when it seemed as if, as Adam, brilliantly wrote in the Atlantic, that once it was widely known that it was Black and brown people disproportionately dying, suddenly states started to open back up, which was another sort of slap in the faces of these people. And so people were reeling from that. And then came Ahmaud Arbery, right? And then came Breonna Taylor. And then came, Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper in Central Park. And on that same day, of course, came George Floyd. And it was almost like, people were already reeling. They were already suffering. They had already been bent over. And the killings of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and having to witness, and these are some of the most horrific police and vigilante sort of deaths we've seen in recent memory. I think people were undone. I think at that point, people took to the streets.
A lot of the questions we're receiving are about practical steps, things that Americans can do, that our leaders can do, our cities and police departments can do at this moment. So I want to break them apart into a few different categories. And let's start off by thinking about anti-racism at the individual level. So an ordinary American sitting in their home and thinking, either I'm newly cognizant of these issues, or perhaps I'm newly committed to trying to do something about them. Where would you tell somebody like that to start?
Well, I think if first and foremost, it's critically important for every individual, if they are still quarantining, to spend this quarantine studying in deep thought and in deep reflection about their own personal conceptual history, and having a willingness to really reflect on whether they've consumed racist ideas, whether they've been blinded to the pandemic of health disparities and police violence due to their racist ideas, and for them to challenge themselves and strive personally to be anti-racist. And then in that striving to change themselves, they begin to look around in their own institutions, in their own communities, and figure out, okay, what are the racial justice, social justice organizations who are operating here, or the policymakers or the campaigns that are challenging racism, and to think very deeply about, okay, how can I support these organizations, these powerful figures, these campaigns? Do I have time? Do I have funds? Do I have expertise? How can I give myself to this struggle?
One thing that you've done for us in the past is recommended potential readings. So I'll step out and say that both Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist are exceptional books. Are there other things that you would point people toward, as you say, if they want to read, if they want to study in this time?
Well, I think if the topic has to do with police violence and mass incarceration and criminal justice more broadly, I would first and foremost recommend everything that Angela Davis has written, because she's been writing about this topic for 50 years. Long before we were recognizing the problem of mass incarceration, she was calling for the abolition of prisons. So like her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? Which probably for me is her most important book, an influential book. Or of course, books that I think are more well known, like, The New Jim Crow or Just Mercy. But even extending out, if you want to really understand the history of Black people and health in America, there's a book called Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, or even Dorothy Roberts' Fatal Invention. I mean, these are books that I think would be very helpful for folks.
Mm-hmm. And now let's move from the individual level to the institutional level, perhaps. And what's interesting to me is we're getting questions from a variety of perspectives here. Kelly from Mamaroneck, New York, asks if originally the protesters' demand was for increased charges against the George Floyd officers, and those charges have now been filed, where do the protests end? And I have other questions here from readers who are wondering about, here for instance is one from a viewer named Sonia who wonders what anti-racist policies can the governors and mayors make to immediately address racism and police brutality. So if a public official were to be interested in trying to make meaningful reforms in response to these protests, where should they start?
So I think one of the many groups who are talking about potential policy changes, and one of them, for instance, is Campaign Zero. And Campaign Zero, if you go to joincampaignzero.org, they talk about 10 different kinds of policy solutions, from having community oversight over police, which of course would truly allow for the police to serve the people. The drastic limitation of course, the use of force, for when police officers engage in police violence, for there always to be an independent investigation and prosecution. For, of course, we've talked about body cams, from, training that ensures that police officers with racist ideas cannot become police officers. Something as simple as ending for-profit policing, the demilitarization, of police units, and something that they've been dealing with in Minneapolis is fair police union contracts. And so one of the reasons why the officer who killed George Floyd was even still on the force was because of the power of their union. And the union is so powerful that, unlike in our job, when police officers make a mistake, they don't get punished. Or if they do get punished by senior police officials, arbitrators are easily or oftentimes able to overrule those punishments because of the power of the union. And the union boss, of course, for the Minneapolis police union is a known white nationalist.
So you focused here on policing reforms, which is, of course, the core of the protests. We talked earlier about how there are economic injustices and other forms of systemic racism which have become targets of these protests as well, and perhaps also undergird some of the policing disparities that the protests have focused on. Several readers are wondering about things like education and housing, and whether there are things that could be done in response to these protests that go beyond policing alone.
So, I mean, I think, let me give an example. I think in the American Nightmare, we cited an AmFAR study that found that what was more predictive of Black people being infected and dying of COVID-19 than their pre-existing conditions was the water quality of their neighborhoods. And so obviously what we know happened in Flint is a national problem. There's so many communities that are typically Black and brown and poor that have poorer water quality. And so, standardizing high quality water all over this country is something that can have dramatic impact on people's health. The same thing with air pollution. Air pollution was another factor that was more predictive. And so obviously Black and brown people are more likely to live near waste transfer stations or other polluted sites. And so creating a mechanism such that, you know, no American community is forced to live in a polluted neighborhood or is forced to live near a massive bus depot where thereby the kids in that nearby neighborhood pretty much all have asthma. There was also access to healthcare, and I should say health insurance. And so obviously, you know, I've long been an advocate of Medicare for all, or some sort of system in which we all have healthcare. And because you have massive disparities currently in health insurance. And, you know, we can sort of go on, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, you know, we've looked at the individual level, the communal level. I want to zoom out even a little further and think about the national level. Several readers have asked us about history textbooks, particularly we've had 2 or 3 questions about educating young Americans and whether that might be the place to start, looking at changing the curriculum. What kind of a story would you like to see told in schools, or maybe what kinds of tools would you like to see placed at the disposal of kids?
Oh, I mean, I would love for our schools to be built on a learning experience that teaches children, that teaches young people that there's nothing really wrong with people, that the people are equals, and that not just racially, that men and, you know, men and women and are equals, and people who are heterosexual are equal with people who are queer, and Jews and Muslims and Christians and people of any religion are all on the same level. And you know, there are so many different ways in which people are different based on religion and based on race and gender and sexual orientation and ethnicity and nationality. And there's so much difference in the United States. And instead of teaching that difference and instead of leveling that difference, instead we try to standardize this single American story. When indeed there is a single American story, but it's made up of so many American stories and we can teach both simultaneously. And we can teach young people to appreciate difference, to recognize that when there is inequities between groups, it's because of bad policy and not people. And then that would allow those children to grow up and be able to fix the problems of our society such that they're fixing those problems as opposed to protesting against those problems in the streets.
Here's a more personal question, which comes from a viewer named Rachel. She's wondering, how do you simultaneously maintain your energy to fight racism while grieving the constant losses in our community? She writes, I'm committed to fight for my brothers and sisters, but I'm fearful I won't be able to sustain myself. Do you have an answer for her?
I do not know. I mean, I feel like I've been doing this as long as I can sort of remember. I think I do try to maintain my own personal physical health, you know, whether that's through, you know, exercising or being a vegan, or, you know, trying to get a certain adequate amount of sleep. Because I think with anybody who works in any type of demanding sector or place, or traumatic or difficult, it's more important for them to really practice, you know, what we call it now, self-care. And because we can't really care for the community, you know, if we aren't sort of caring for ourselves. So that's what I do. I also have in a way, a long view, you know, being an historian. And so I'm actually thinking that these things have been happening for longer than even 400 years. And I'm just more so focused on the future and change and you know, of course, mourning to transform, you know, as opposed to mourning to mourn.
You know, one definition of history is the study of change over time. Sometimes the study of American racism is the study of persistence over time. Do you see things in America's historical record that give you reason for hope that there may be more change than persistence in the future, or perhaps things at this moment that they give you reason for thinking that?
Well, I mean, Yoni, I actually am coming out in a few weeks with a board book entitled Antiracist Baby. And I was very, very nervous about this book because first and foremost, I prefer writing history, and now I'm writing a board book for it. But even because I know how many people struggle, older people struggle to talk about racism and even think about striving to be anti-racist, in their 30s and 40s. And so I suspected that it would be very difficult for people to have these conversations with 2-year-olds and 1-year-olds. And I also knew that studies showed that many people were believed that babies were colorblind, even though the data shows otherwise. And so I was skeptical. But what I've seen, since as we've gotten closer to this book release, and I've spent even the better part of time on TV this week talking to people about how they talk to this about racism with their 4-year-old, with their 7-year-old. And that has given me a tremendous amount of hope. And the reason is because, whether we're 30 or we're 3, it's going to be hard to talk about racism. But if we start, because of our parents and our guardians and our loved ones, having these conversations at 3 years old, at 2 years old, at 6 years old, can you imagine what that person who started at 3 years old talking about race and racism is going to be like when they're 35? They're going to be much more capable of having these difficult conversations, of really challenging themselves, of really challenging society. And so that's the type of populace we need.
I've got a question here about what happens when that 3-year-old turns 18. Ramona asks, can you speak to the importance or lack of importance of voter turnout this November in the midst of so much frustration and loss of faith in institutional change through our government? We've gotten several questions in this room from people who are wondering whether we can reasonably ask Americans to place their faith in electoral democracy, whether the protests are perhaps an indicator that people are losing faith in other forms of change.
Well, I mean, I think it's certainly the case that studies have shown in recent years that a certain segment of the population is either not voting at all, or is, as we, wrote about, as I wrote about, a series of essays in the Atlantic, people are, what I call the other swing voters. And these are people who are swinging between voting Democrat and not voting. And this just so happens to primarily be young people, and especially young people of color. And who are the people who are primarily making up these protests all over the country? You have young people, young white people, and certainly young people of color. And I think what's critical for Americans to think about when they think about this group is they should consider them and conceive of them as swing voters. And what that means is when you think about the traditional older white swing voter who swings between voting Democrat and Republican, and you're a Democrat and you're trying to get them to vote, let's say, for Biden, and they voted for Trump in 2016, typically people are going to view them as political free agents. They're going to view them as people that need to be persuaded. And I think it's critically important for people to view these young Latinx voters who may have voted in 2012 but didn't vote in 2016 as the same, as political free agents. They should not be viewed as political cattle in which you just shame them and ostracize them to the polls, because that's going to only alienate them further. And so if there's a recognition of their own alienation, we should not then sort of add to that alienation by shaming them to the polls.
One question here is about, of your name, Shannon, about bringing anti-racism into rural communities. I know that you've often thought about how you speak with loved ones about this. And I remember an essay that you wrote one Thanksgiving for us, in which the answer that you gave surprised me a little. You said, start with yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should certainly start with ourselves. I suspect most Americans who are striving to transform their loved ones are maybe like Amy Cooper, you know, who's a liberal, who as many people know, of course, was threatening a Black man, then called the police and claimed that she was being threatened. But then when we...
Walking a dog in Central Park, who then
Yes.
threatened an African-American bird watcher.
But then after we, you know, as we're sort of working on ourselves, what we should first and foremost be doing with that crazy uncle that people always tell me about, is really, especially if the relationship itself has been damaged with our brother, with our uncle, with our father, meaning we're not even on speaking terms because we can't really deal with their politics. I think what's first and foremost we have to do is regain the relationship. We have to rebuild the relationship. We have to rebuild the trust. And the reason why that's critical is because there's no way you're going to be able to help someone transform themselves if they don't trust you, if there's no relationship there. And I think while you're rebuilding that relationship, you should really be asking questions to really figure out, and not in an obvious way that you're trying to do this, but to really try to figure out what is really drawing them to Trump, or what is really drawing them to racism. And the reason being is because for every person it's different, and for every person it's something very personal to them. And chances are their conception of their own history is possibly false. And so I think, and that's something that but you won't even know that, and you won't even be able to really meet them where they are if you don't really know what's driving them. And so, you know, I think you should be rebuilding that relationship. And again, seeking to really understand the source of the pain and the fear and the hate that's driving them, you know, away from you.
When you look out at the world right now, particularly the United States, what are you most worried about at this moment?
Oh, I'm most worried about literally a civil war, and not necessarily a civil war between the North and the South, the civil war between protesters and the Trump administration, who has decided to bring troops to cities all over this country to declare martial law. And I suspect, and so that's what I most fear. I most fear that. And because obviously many people will be hurt, and simultaneously, you know, it would, I think, ruin this country even further.
I have a question here from a viewer named Tamika Jackson, who is irritated, she says, when candidates talk about the Black vote as a commodity rather than addressing the issues that Black communities deal with. We're headed toward a November election. In some ways, it's a referendum on the current president. In others, both these candidates are out there trying to earn the votes of different American communities. What do you want to hear from a candidate who wants support from Black Americans?
Well, I mean, I think both candidates have a lot of room to apologize, to admit to, specifically if we're talking about Black voters, to admit to their support or articulation of past racist ideas and policies, and the ways in which those policies or even ideas have led to this current moment, to this current crisis. I think Biden in particular should probably focus his appeal to young Black voters, which is the very segment of Black America that he struggled with. Even at the time he was doing well with Black voters in general, he was still behind, typically in most states, Bernie Sanders with young Black voters. And these are typically voters who, at least during the last election cycle, there are two major issues that they wanted Secretary Clinton to speak to was racism and police brutality. And she actually did courageously, in the beginning of her campaign, pledge to end mass incarceration. And so I think that is the type of statement that Vice President Biden really needs to speak to them, because they are swing voters. You know, just as they're swing voters who swing between Democrat and not voting. And again, it really has nothing to do with Trump. They are only, for many of them, are deciding whether they're going to vote for Biden or not at all. And I think it's going to be based on what Biden says and does. And I think it's absolutely critical that he speaks to them.
So I'm sorry that there are literally dozens and dozens of questions that we're not going to be able to get to this afternoon. And I hope that all of our viewers will keep reading and be in touch as they have other things to say. I want to end here by asking you whether there's a final message you'd like to leave us with this afternoon, Dr. Kendi.
Well, I mean, I think that it's easy now, and I suspect many of us are feeling this sort of whirlwind of both a viral pandemic, an economic pandemic, and a racial sort of pandemic. And I don't want us to believe that this is not something that we can combat, that it's not something that we can overcome. It's not something that is the result of bad policy decisions in the past that we can then make differently in the future. And so I think we should be focused, if we truly want relief for the upwards of 40 million people who are out of a job, or out of 3, I believe, Americans who are out of work, or the more than 100,000 now people who died of COVID, or Black people who have died at twice their population percentage, or the number of names that are being said, from Breonna Taylor to Ahmaud Arbery. If people really want relief for these people, then we need to change, power and policy. And obviously, the narratives that sort of shape those policies and power, and every one of us can be a part of this struggle.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kendi, for making the time to talk with us this afternoon. Unfortunately, we're going to need to leave it there. Thanks to all who joined us this afternoon to watch. We hope that you'll visit theatlantic.com and subscribe to support our journalism. And we also hope that you'll join us for our next Big Story online event, which will be next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. A conversation with the Atlantic's Frank Foer and McKay Coppins about Russian interference in our elections in 2016 and 2020. We'll send you more details via email, so stay tuned for that, and we'll see you there. Thank you.